Welcome to everybody here today, whether you're in the Washington, D.C. local community or whether you're elsewhere in the country or in the world. We welcome all of you, and we are looking forward to this evening's program on coming of age in a new reality of anti-Semitism. I am Art Hessel. I'm vice president of the Haberman Institute. For those of you who are new to our lectures and classes, we're glad you're here. We do have a mission, and the mission is to provide adults with high quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. And that is exactly what we're doing this evening. Before we get to tonight's program, let me remind you, if you haven't already seen this somewhere, that our next program is going to be on September 21st at 1 p.m. And it's going to be a virtual tour of a museum that many of you have probably not gone to in person. It's the Museum of Galician Jewish History in Krakow, Poland. And we are going to be led on this tour by the director of the museum. I have been to the museum, and the works in their permanent exhibit, which has to do with synagogues before and after World War II in Poland, is quite fascinating. And so I hope most of you can attend that. You can look at our other classes by going to our website, www.habermaninstitute.org, and you will see that we have a really strong series of programs and classes coming up for the fall, and we're adding more all the time. So now on to tonight. We're going to talk about anti-Semitism. As we all know, in the first half of the last century, anti-Semitism was so prevalent and led to such disastrous consequences. But in the second half of that century, when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s and after, I never came across anti-Semitism at home, at school, at university. Never really entered my mind as a problem. I thought it was gone. But here we are, and it seems to be rising its head very uncomfortably one more time. So tonight we have with us Dr. Samanthan Meinrath, a lifelong Jewish educator and learner. There she is. I'm glad she's there. She's an expert on Jewish teens, on Generation Z. I don't know what Generation Z is, but she does. On experiential education, on Israel, on questions of Jewish identity. She's on a lifelong mission to inspire conversations that help move Jewish journeys forward, and she's passionate about connecting with learners and communities everywhere. She currently serves as the Senior Director of Knowledge, Ideas, and Learning at the Jewish Education Project in New York. She teaches at Gratz College, and she is a constant brainstorming the Jewish past, present, and future. She's an alumna of the University of Pittsburgh, the Jewish Theological Seminary, Gratz College, and the Pardes Experiential Educators Program. She lives in Westchester, New York, and that's where she is now. She is the author of a book that you can't get yet, but will be able to soon, on anti-Semitism, coming of age during the resurgence of hate. And with that, Samantha, it is all yours, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction, and thank you to all of you who are coming from so many different places to be here tonight. It's really an honor to be here to speak with you. The only caveat that I will give is that the bio has been updated since I had sent it, and the book is available. So I'm excited to share the link to that later this evening as well. So I was brought today to talk about anti-Semitism, and to talk about anti-Semitism in the context of the next generation, the young people who are coming of age Jewishly today. I would love to invite everyone. I believe the chat is open, And if you are comfortable sharing, what brings you to this conversation? I would love to just know, as point of context for those, again, who feel comfortable sharing either with the whole group, or if you'd like to message me directly, you can message just hosts and panelists. What has brought you to this space? And while I give everyone a minute to do that, I'm going to share what brought me to this space. I grew up in, I would say, a pretty typical American Jewish story and environment. I'm from Long Island, as are many. And I grew up in a public school environment. I have an Israeli father and an American mother, and I loved being Jewish from the beginning. I was so excited to be involved in my religious school, in my youth movement. It made me feel special going to Israel. I went there the way that other people went to their grandparents' house in Florida to visit my Saba and Savta, to see my cousins. And I had this whole world that was centered around independence that I didn't have growing up in New York. On Long Island, I wasn't allowed to cross the street by myself, much less than go into Manhattan. And going to Israel, I was able to take the bus with my cousins by myself, and go to the beach, and it was fine. But then I came home and was telling my friends at my school about, my summers or my winter break experiences, and they were terrified. How were my parents being so neglectful as to let me go unsupervised to Israel? And I got into this role of educator without even knowing it, by explaining a reality that I knew to be so true, of feeling comfortable, of having more independence, and came into this space of Jewish education through an organic, perhaps unexpected way. And as you heard, I identify as a lifelong Jewish educator. How I came to anti-Semitism in particular, again, slightly convoluted. I did my doctoral research actually in the Washington, D.C. Jewish community. I interviewed perhaps individuals who many of you, high school students who had participated in some kind of congregational B'nai Mitzvah experience, but had opted out of formal Jewish education and engagement. And I wanted to understand from their perspectives, what was the value add that Judaism brought into their lives? What was keeping them from being engaged and connected in the ways that those of us who work in the Jewish community and those of us who are stakeholders in the Jewish community might have wanted them to be? What were they dealing with? And in one of the questions that I asked, I said, what comes to mind when I say Jewish space? What is a Jewish space for you? And they answered in all the ways that I would have expected: school, synagogue, camp, my grandma's house. They know what Jewish environments are. And then I asked the follow-up question, do you feel comfortable in those spaces? Because I wanted to understand from these young people coming of age, is maybe the reason that you're not opting into those spaces based on something that happened or some level of discomfort, or are you feeling super comfortable and there's something else keeping you from being there? And I expected the conversation to go the way that so many conversations with my own peers or on my own Shabbat dinner table went. I thought we would have these meta existential conversations. Does the Jewish community affirm my gender identity? Are my politics welcome? Are my Israel opinions part of the majority? Like, do I feel comfortable bringing my full self to whatever the Jewish space is? And instead, the answers that I got were what I have since started to refer to as heartbreakingly practical. Instead of hearing about the why and the meta, I got responses much more to the effect of, since the shooting at Congregation Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, the synagogue that my family goes to always has an armed guard at the door. So I guess I feel comfortable. Or, oh yeah, the day schools in our community got government funding for bulletproof glass for the windows. And it's too bad that we needed to do that. So I don't know if I feel safe, but I guess I'm comfortable because I know that it's there. And I started to realize how big this generation gap had become, as someone who works with teens, who knows this population of young people really, really intimately. they were coming of age in a different world than I did, in a space where anti-Semitism is shaping their Jewish choices and their Jewish experiences, where they have an awareness of the presence of danger when it comes to being Jewish, where they know about this, they feel this truth. And I started to realize that this was the story that I wanted to understand and ultimately to share, and pivoted after finishing the original thesis for my doctorate to this deep dive into anti-Semitism and what it means for Gen Zers to come of age at this moment. I want to pause and say thank you to all who have shared your whys for being here. I'm seeing having children, having grandchildren, fear about what's happening in our country right now, connection to anti-Semitism in our own origin stories, either individually or, and I'm synthesizing this as part of the collectivity of the Jewish people. And I just really want to thank everyone who has shared, and I invite you to continue to do so throughout if you choose to. I would like to share a little bit of insight from my experience as an educator, and then get into the facts and the stats and the stories and really why we're all here, the meat of this. I also just want to name, there's a Q&A function in this panel. If you have a question throughout, please feel free to type it in to the Q&A box in particular. That's going to be easier to monitor than the ongoing chat. And I look forward to answering your questions throughout, as well as in the designated time at the end. So as an educator, I have spent a great deal of time thinking about what success means, and what success in particular means for me, as I have the pleasure of sharing knowledge and experiences and meaning-making opportunities with my learners of all ages, but mainly adolescents and young adults. There are plenty of easy answers to that question of success. I am successful if they find meaning in my words and in the lessons that I guide them through. And if the experience is fun, because we want them to have positive Jewish experiences. And if when they think back on their Jewish educational experiences and encounters later in life, it's with those positive feelings. I believe all of that to be true. But what drives me in the work that I'm blessed to do every day and privileged to do every day is the goal for my learners to crave whatever is coming next. I never want my learners in any encounter to come away feeling fully satisfied, to walk away from our time together with a mindset that they've somehow checked today's Jewish education off their to-do lists and can now count themselves knowledgeable and effectively move on from the experience. Instead, my goal is to leave every learner that I encounter seeking more. I see my role as an educator as being that of sparking interest and connection, and hopefully, again, next steps. I do not seek to provide exhaustive knowledge on any topic, and the book, #Antisemitism, was no different. It's a snapshot in time at a critical and unprecedented moment in American history. I sought to provide multiple perspectives, insights from the breadth and the depth of Jewish Gen Zers and those who care about them. And inevitably, I failed. There are voices who are underserved in this narrative. And while none of those omissions were purposeful, my hope is that they continue to pave the way for others to fill those gaps and to contribute their own stories to this unfolding conversation about anti-Semitism. So I just want to name and frame all of that as we jump in. So if you give me one moment, I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, here we go. So here we are at the state of anti-Semitism in 2022. And as I said just now, finishing this book was one of the hardest things that I've done, solely because there always seems to be a next story. Every time I thought that I had finished and we got to a really good closing place, unfortunately, current events kept moving along and there kept being more and more that I could have added. So again, it's a snapshot in time. For those who just want a point of reference, Generation Z is the demographic cohort following millennials. There's a few different start dates, but essentially 1997 is the cutoff year between when the millennial generation ends and Gen Z begins. The generation following that is colloquially starting to be referred to as Gen Alpha, but Gen Z goes all the way through today's late elementary schoolers. So that's really what we're talking about here. So the why of anti-Semitism. First, want to give a definition to make sure that we're all at least mostly on the same page. While many of us can speak to anti-Semitism either from our personal experiences or our inherent understanding and knowing of what this world's oldest hatred is, this is the definition that I was working off of. So this is from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and was adopted in 2016. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. This is a really comprehensive, I think, definition. It encompasses kind of anything and everything that anti-Semitism might manifest as. It might be hatred towards Jews. It also might not be hatred towards Jews and might be perceptions of Jews that might be thought of as positive. One of the anecdotes that came up in the interviews that I conducted for the book was about, Jews are rich, and a girl, her college roommate asked her, so where are you going for spring break? Where are you going on vacation? And her response was, I'm not going on vacation. Like, I'm staying here. Oh, I thought all Jews had money. We got to have a conversation. Did that count as anti-Semitism? It wasn't hatred. It wasn't violent. It wasn't, anything that could be seen as bad, but it was kind of uncomfortable to be encountering this idea that, yeah, of course you're Jewish, you must have money. So falling into that category as might be hatred, might be something else, but is definitely a stereotype. We also have this idea of anti-Semitism being directed towards both Jewish and or non-Jewish individuals, particularly those as they're associated with the Jewish community or in spaces that are thought of as Jewish communal spaces, might become victims of anti-Semitism or be impacted by anti-Semitism, whether or not they officially identify as members of the Jewish community. So just naming all of these factors. I want to show a short video clip, should be about 1 minute long, exploring in this phase of rising anti-Semitism. What does this mean for young people today?
22% of American Jews say
they have refrained from wearing or displaying items
that might reveal their Jewishness
over the last 12 months.
My dad told me to wear a hat the other day. Usually I like to wear that on the street.
It's simply saying, I don't want to necessarily have to suffer through another verbal assault.
It's harder to think about wanting to wear a star. I personally do, because I want to be that opposite. I want to be the person who's proud of my heritage.
I want other Jews to see me and know that there's a Jew standing over here.
We need to stand strong, and we can't be afraid of what might happen if we do show our Jewishness.
Hiding our Jewish identity is not going to solve the problem.
We need to be proud and visibly Jewish.
I wear a Magen David. I've never taken it off, ever. People should be allowed to display their faiths and identities proudly and securely, and American Jews should feel no differently than that.
So I shared this video clip from our colleagues, my colleagues at the AJC, the American Jewish Committee, to really explore and express how young people are figuring out what does it mean to make Jewish choices in the face of rising anti-Semitism. The rise in anti-Semitism cannot be denied. We see it in different spaces. We see it from the political left and from the right. We see it online, and we see in-person physical intimidation. We see so many different manifestations, and then we see different choices being made in the wake of that uptick in anti-Semitism. On the one hand, we might see someone who says, as some of the speakers in the video said, I don't want anyone to know that I'm Jewish. I want to be under the radar, and it's really frightening to say that someone might be threatening towards me, or even just that they wouldn't like me because of this thing about myself that I'm figuring out. I'm in a lifelong relationship with my own Judaism, or I've not really connected with. And they might say, I'm not going to wear my Jewish star to the mall, or my IDF t-shirt that I got on Birthright to the store today. I'm just going to kind of slide under the radar. And that's a reaction to anti-Semitism. At the same time, we have people who, just by virtue of being told that you shouldn't show off that part of yourself, are going to come at it with defiance and say, I'm going to go get a Jewish star the size of a hubcap, and I'm going to wear it around my neck, and you will never tell me that anti-Semitism or hatred of any kind should dictate my behaviors. That's also a reaction to anti-Semitism. The choices that are being made on both sides of that equation are in response to this external force, and each one is legitimate. And as we think about the young people in each of our lives, understanding what they're responding to and then how it manifests for them are two super critical steps. So hang on. Okay, so I'm going to give a few key statistics. And all of these are from 2021 from a few different sources, the Anti-Defamation League, as well as the American Jewish Committee and their respective research conducted that year. And I'll point out which is which. 90% of American Jews in 2021 believe anti-Semitism is a very serious problem or somewhat of a problem. That's from the AJC study. When was the last time 90% of American Jews agreed on anything? So we can say this is a huge problem for that type of number to understand that this is so critical at this moment. 60%, conversely, of the general public, when asked the same question, believes that anti-Semitism is either a very serious problem or somewhat of a problem. Now, while that number is still significant in that it's more than half of the general population understands the challenge in this moment, it's also really concerning that if 90%, this overwhelming majority of Jews see it, and only 60% of the overall world population, national population in the United States, what are we doing with that gap, the perception versus the reality of how Jews are self-identifying their own fears, our own fears and concerns, and what the overall population agrees that we have a space and a right to be concerned about. The second disparate statistic, older Americans are more likely to say that anti-Semitism is a problem, with 70% of those 65 plus agreeing with that statement, as opposed to 52% of those ages 18 to 35. This particular study did not incorporate minors, but to say that young people might not actually know what counts as anti-Semitism a lot of the time. And that was something that I encountered throughout, and something that I encourage everyone to have a really frank conversation about. What counts? A lot of young people can say, okay, someone drew a swastika on my locker at school. I get that. I know that that counted as anti-Semitism. But someone made an awkward, offhand remark, a joke that, you know, if it had been made by a Jewish friend, I might have laughed at in a self-deprecating way, but now I'm not sure. Did that count as anti-Semitism, or was it just awkward? And figuring out that delineation of your feelings are valid, and while something might not have been intended as an act of hatred, if it's singling you out and making you uncomfortable in a shared context based on your Jewish identity, you can claim that either as anti-Semitism or simply as a discomfort, a microaggression, something that it's okay to name and claim and say, I'm uncomfortable and I need to unpack that. Next stat, 1 in every 4 American Jews was a victim of anti-Semitism between 2020 and 2021. This comes back to this question of what counts. Thank God we are not in a space where 1 in every 4 American Jews was physically attacked, God forbid, in an act of anti-Semitism. But when it comes to slurs being used, both in person and again, a lot in the space of digital communication and social media. This number is staggering for that many people to have felt directly personally impacted by anti-Semitism in one calendar year. And finally, in the ADL's most recent audit of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States, they recorded more than 2,100 acts of assault, vandalism, and harassment that fall under the category of anti-Semitism. So we're dealing with real things here. We're dealing with staggering numbers and a reality that is a paradigm shift from the way that many of us were lucky enough to grow up, where anti-Semitism was a historical fact, perhaps a mitigating factor in someone else's stories, but certainly not our own. I want to share this other quick video clip. This is from Instagram, from a TikTok influencer in the Cleveland, Ohio area.
People that are in charge of the entire world. And these people are not what they say that they are. These people are the high power, the elites that run the world. They claim to be Jews, and I'm just going to say that they are not what they claim. Their God is not the same God as you and I, and they want you to think it is. I very much encourage you to look deep into this because you will find the truth, and it's a very evil truth. When I say that they are in control of everything, this bag of M&Ms, if you just look at right here, this U with a circle, every single dollar that we spend goes to these elites. Look it up. We think that we're free, but we're not. We're free-range chickens. We're human cattle for them to make money off of. Let me get into the money aspect.
So this one I'm sharing, again, not to give extra credence to this influencer, self-described influencer, but to demonstrate what people are seeing online, particularly in the spaces where so many Gen Zers are spending their time and being influenced and maybe laughing and rolling their eyes that M&Ms are a demonstration of Jews controlling the world. But if we're seeing this type of thing enough and in a pervasive enough way, it's becoming part of the culture. It's becoming part of how people are seeing themselves and what they're having to answer for. So I want to start sharing some of the findings through the conversations that I had with Gen Zers about this topic of anti-Semitism in all of its manifestations and all of its implications for Jewish identity. And I'm going to share some narrative behind each one. So first up, let's talk about Israel, because we can't talk about anti-Semitism today's day and age without talking about anti-Zionism and what does it mean to be Jewish in the United States and be asked to answer for or expected to have answers for Israel and the actions of the Israeli government, for better or for worse. So this is Ariel, who is a Jewish Instagrammer. She's a high school senior at the time that I interviewed her, from Connecticut. I don't like that as soon as someone hears that I'm Jewish, they automatically bring up Israel. They're not one and the same, but they're not fully separate either. It's really easy to say that millennials and Gen Zers, are we checked out? Do we not care as much about Israel? How do young people today not understand how important it is to be voices for Israel? I chose Ariel's quote to highlight because it talks about how uncomfortable it can be to be an American Jew. Maybe you've never been to Israel. Maybe you've been, but as a tourist with a connection, but it's not necessarily, where you live. We can have a conversation about the existential homeland of the Jewish people and Zionism and what we are or aren't doing as a community to foster connections between young people in Israel. But ultimately, for a Gen Zer to step into a space and be told that they have to answer for Israel is intimidating. It's terrifying. It's something that helps them shut down because they are concerned about what it means to give voice to an entire people, a population that they might know intimately, they might not necessarily know at all, but they know that they're supposed to care and they are connected whether or not they wish to speak to it. Next up, we have on the Holocaust. So switching gears a bit. I get confused about other people's sensitivities regarding Holocaust imagery. when people said you can't call the detention facilities on the southern border a concentration camp, well, why not? If that's what it's going to take to get my parents to listen to what's going on, why not? I think that's a fine way to use our history. Mara was a freshman at SUNY Binghamton when I interviewed her, and is the child of two rabbis. And she took this perspective that Holocaust imagery is something that is being corrupted and co-opted in so many different ways. We're seeing Holocaust and Nazi imagery used to describe Israeli soldiers, the ultimate historical just anomaly and oh my goodness, what has happened to us moment. And she was speaking about what does it mean to use that imagery to talk about contemporary issues and to take it external to the Jewish community. We had a lot of conversations about allyship, and I want to highlight that phrase. So many Gen Zers, Jewish Gen Zers, see themselves as universalists. It's very uncomfortable for them to be particularist, to say that we're something different and special and held apart. They are citizens of the world. They identify with the world, the global community, and the struggles and opportunities therein. So to take our own internal specific Jewish experience and apply it externally to vulnerable populations and what they see as populations in need is something really comfortable for them. And when we have conversations with Gen Zers, it's important to understand the global context through which they are approaching what so many of us might see as a particularly Jewish experience and question. Next up, we have on Jewish choices. This is from Ilana, who is a Rockville, Maryland. She was a high school freshman at the time that she and I spoke. Every time I see anti-Semitism on social media, I feel like I have to make a choice. Am I going to comment back and get into a whole spam war over it? Or should I just let it go and keep scrolling and not engage? I think this was such a profound question because it really highlights the different options available to every Gen Zer each time that they're seeing something happening online. They can opt out. They can say, I don't really feel like dealing with this. I'm going to go to the next TikTok video, the next dance, the next meme, and just like it and move on. Or they can get into it. They can comment back. They can start a conversation that they might not be sure how it'll end. Part of our role, the role of Jewish educators, the role of parents and grandparents and stakeholders and those who care about young people coming of age, the way that I see it, is for them to feel empowered to make that choice, to not say, I want to say something, but I don't actually know what to say and I don't feel confident. And what if they say something that I, don't know how to respond to? It's so real to not necessarily know how to respond and to want to opt out. But for those who want to engage in this dialogue and to be proactively Jewish, visibly Jewish, particularly in online spaces as well as in person, giving them the tools and the confidence and the grounding in their own identities and their own stories that they need in order to do so, I see as of absolutely critical importance. Next up, we have physical safety. So anti-Semitism, while there's a lot happening online and there's a lot happening in these meta spaces, it's also a physical question for far too many of us. Abby, who's the mother of two Gen Zers, is based in New York and shared that since the shooting at Tree of Life, we keep our voices down more when we talk about being Jewish in public. Be respectful of others. We are who we are, but we don't claim it as much. This to me was one of the most heartbreaking things that I saw, because she's not questioning her own Judaism. She doesn't want her kids to question it, want to be loud and proud, but the choice is being made to be quiet and proud, to tone it down a little bit, to not, in our unfolding conversation, she had said, when, it's the Christmas season and my kid is asking really loudly about what are we getting for Hanukkah, she's cautioning, be a little bit more quiet. Just say, what are we getting as a gift? Not pretending that we're something that we're not, but not fully claiming who we are. And I think that's one of the most frightening realities today, is this choice that might be being made about toning down and watering down, so to speak, acknowledging who we are and what that means. Next up, we have on social media. I posted a video about making gefilte fish on TikTok, and people responded with Free Palestine. And then they said that they wished Hitler had killed both sides of my family, the Jewish and the Romani, in the Holocaust. Elisheva is a Jewish slash Roma Instagrammer from Ohio. When I interviewed her, she was a freshman in college and was exploring what it meant to have this dual identity as both Jewish and Roma, two minority populations that had been targeted in the Holocaust, have since been pretty much disassociated from one another, other than that particular moment in shared history, but that both manifest in her. And what Elisheva was really struggling with was trying to connect culturally with her Judaism, not to talk about Israel, not to talk about anything essentially controversial, unless, you want to have a throwdown over gefilte fish. And she felt like her virtual space didn't even allow her to do that without attracting hate and vitriol. The social media element of all of this is increasingly fascinating when it comes to the choices that Jewish young people are making. Many Jewish teens in particular, if they go on summer Israel experiences, are creating not fake, but alternative social media accounts for the purposes of those trips, because they don't want their regular Instagram or their regular TikTok to be spammed and covered with anti-Israel or anti-Jewish hatred. Instead, keeping those kind of whatever the and other is of their lives, with dances and crafts and time with friends and pumpkin spice lattes as we get into the season, and putting the Israel stuff elsewhere. And while they're still using Israel, because that's how young people document their lives and the lens through which they view the world is through this social media experience, segmenting out their Israel / Jewish selves from the rest of their real selves is an increasingly common trend that I think is something to note and is concerning. Next up, we have on Jewish identity, and we're back to Mara, the student at SUNY Binghamton. My optimism has been informed by my Jewish values, the things that I was taught, and the idea that we're on an upward trajectory towards making the world a more whole place. I really want to emphasize this is not meant to be doom and gloom exclusively. Young Jews love being Jewish. They're proud of it. They see it as a value add. They see it as a part of their identities that brings them joy and enables them to move through the world in unique and powerful and beautiful ways. And when we let anti-Semitism stamp out any part of that light and that joy, it's a heartbreaking win. So I encourage you, when you're in conversation with the young people in your life, talk about the hard things. Absolutely. Explore what they're up against, but also give them a space to see Judaism as that value add and to explore their Jewish identities through a lens of joy. Next up, we have words from the parent of 3 Gen Zers about what it means to parent Jewish Gen Z. Success would be if my kids see Judaism as an obligation, but not a burden in their lives. I see college students who will say they're only Jewish inside their homes, and in these little bubbles, but they don't want to put up signs advertising Hillel events or show their Judaism outside of those limited spaces. I want my kids to be comfortable being Jewish wherever they are. And this really, again, speaks to the inverse of that idea of segmenting out, especially on social media, when you're Jewish and when you're not. This is a desire to say, I am authentically all that I am, and part of that is Jewish everywhere that I am, whether I'm in a Jewish environment, which is what started this whole path, as I said originally, of saying, what does it mean to be in a Jewish space? And what does it mean to be outside of a Jewish space? And what does it mean to bring your Judaism and to be your Jewish self wherever you are, showing up Jewishly in whatever environment? Finally, we have On the Jewish Future with Zeke, who is a also Maryland-based high school student. He was a sophomore when he and I spoke, and he said, "We are a damn force to be reckoned with." I thought that was so succinct and so beautiful when it comes to Gen Z. This is a generation that is taking steps and strides, not to be leaders of tomorrow or at some point in an unknown future, but to say right now, all that we are, all that we know, all that we don't necessarily know, we are here and we are ready to take on the challenges of the world. And as those of us who, again, see ourselves as stakeholders and caregivers in the lives of these Gen Zers, in educator speak, we talk a lot about meeting people where they are along their lifelong journeys. This is a space to say we need to meet them where they are right now and dive right in. I want to bring up this idea of Jewish joy from Deborah Lipstadt. We are bearers of a magnificent tradition, one that expresses itself in religious, intellectual, philanthropic, artistic, communal, and political contexts. Despite the best efforts of so many generations of non-Jews to harm, kill, and even annihilate us, we celebrate the multifaceted tradition that is ours and all it has given to the world. We do so not because of the attempt to destroy us, but despite it. And so as we think about anti-Semitism and how it's impacting our young people and their Jewish choices and the paths that they are each setting themselves up on as part of their lifelong Jewish journeys, my goal is that we come in eyes wide open. We explore the hate and how it's manifesting and how it's impacting psychology and philosophy and choice making. And are people voting with their feet by not wanting to be in certain places if they feel frightened by them, or if they're just not sure how to deal with all that identifying as Jewish today encompasses and invites into their lives? We hold that, but we also have to hold this idea of Jewish joy and not letting the realities of today stamp out the eternal optimism and arc towards light of the Jewish people. And how do we make sure that, yes, we're talking about the hard things and that our students, our children, our grandchildren know how to stand up for themselves and how to be voices for the Jewish people. Also, how do they find what inspires them to be those voices? How do we give them the sense of connection and love and excitement and value add of being Jewish and allow that to manifest in each of their lives? This was, I thought, a fabulous post. I promise to love being Jewish 10 times more than anyone hates me for it. And again, this manifests this idea of Jewish joy and how do we respond with joy and defiance at the same time to detractors and hatred. I'm going to pause the screen share for a moment here to explore any questions, and then we'll jump in for another moment. So I'm just pulling up to see what we are dealing with. So we've got a question about the research. How large was the population? Where did the people polled come from? Excuse me. Thank you so much for the question. So my research was not based on a survey. The studies conducted, and I can put links in the chats, by the AJC and the ADL are statistically significant in terms of surveying thousands of people. Mine was a narrative-based qualitative study. The original research for my doctorate included 30 teens from the greater Washington, D.C. area. And when I expanded that into the book to explore anti-Semitism in particular, I set out with a mission of really trying to be geographically inclusive, age and stage inclusive, and Jewish experience inclusive. I sought to meet with individuals who came from Orthodox backgrounds, who had been fully in Jewish spaces in terms of school and camp and congregational life throughout their lives, and to speak to Jews who were in public schools and didn't necessarily identify with the organized Jewish community in any way. Between the teens, the parents, the educators, and the what I would call and other stakeholders that I spoke with, I believe the book had over 100 interviews altogether, as well as, again, supplemental research coming from other people's data sets. I hope that's a comprehensive answer, and I'm happy if the person who posed the question has follow-up to answer to that as well. I'm also seeing comments here about Jewish joy and these conversations about anti-Semitism and what does it mean to respond to anti-Semitism in all of its forms. I think so much of the question about anti-Semitism comes to who do we talk to, when, and about what? For many young people, we have this idea of, I don't want to be the one to escalate things and I don't want to make it awkward. Many conversations that I had spoke about the comparative perceived privilege of the American Jewish community today. And this idea that, yes, someone made an awkward comment on my Instagram, but it could be so much worse. And I am a progressive, woke Gen Zer, and I see, for example, what the African American community is dealing with. And I don't want to escalate this, uncomfortable conversation that I had and make it even more awkward. Oh my goodness. The answer that I end up giving a lot of the time is that when we're playing the oppression Olympics, nobody's here to win. And that the realities of other minority populations and the struggles and hatred and anger and violence that they may be facing is incredibly real and does not detract from the reality that we as Jews might be facing hatred and violence and uncomfortableness and all of the above as well. I also want to highlight the intersectionality and diversity of today's Jewish community. We're not just talking about people with Ashkenormative backgrounds who look Jewish and manifest as Jewish in a way that people think of it. We're talking about the most diverse Jewish generation that has ever been. So when people come and they say, I don't know if that was bad enough to report it and to escalate it. Part of this is helping people to feel empowered in the power and reality of their own narratives, to say that if something happened to you and you are uncomfortable and you are struggling, that in and of itself is worth mentioning and worth figuring out what are we going to do with. One student who I interviewed was a high school student in Connecticut who was the only Jewish person in her grade. And she, in her high school, had a group of boys who, every time that she would walk into a classroom, would give the Nazi salute. And I'm not going to make the hand gesture here. I'm quite sure we can all ascertain what that was and how that looked. And this girl defied the odds. She went and reported it. She said to her teacher, like, what are we doing with this? Because it's really easy to just kind of not say anything and hope that a grown-up in the room, proverbial or otherwise, catches on. But she went and she reported and she said, this is something that's happening. And the teacher's response, well, we don't know if that's anti-Semitism because how do you know it's directed towards you? And like, what, how do you know that that's about your Judaism, even if it is directed towards you? And she said what I would think is glaringly obvious. I'm the only Jew in the room. And when I walk in, they make a Nazi salute. Like, how is this not anti-Semitism? And the conversation had to escalate and had to go to an administrative space and to then figure out, how do we deal with this as a school? How do we deal with this as a community? When there's a question about, is this even valid? When her experience was being potentially invalidated by saying, how do you know that this is real and this is about you? I think part of our role as caregivers and stakeholders in the lives of the next generation of Jewish leaders is to give them a space to name what's happening to them and to know that they're in a supportive environment when they do so, and that we are not here to question, did that really count? But to say your experience is real, and on the spectrum of Jewish history in light of pogroms and the Holocaust and so many atrocities, is this the same as that? No, thank God. But is this real? And is this something that needs to be addressed because of the systemic challenges and issues and hatred being faced by an increasing number of the Jewish community each day, month, and year? In that case, absolutely. I'm going to pause again to look at the chat, and then I'm going to share a couple more slides with you before we go directly into the official Q&A portion. I just want to name that I see this, there's a note to the panelists about the idea of Jewish joy in particular, and how a few comments about Hillel offering opportunities to learn about responses to anti-Semitism in all of its forms. My comment to this is a tremendous yes and. Is it the responsibility of Hillels to figure out how do we help students in campus environments respond to and deal with ongoing encounters with anti-Semitism? Absolutely. Is it just the responsibility of Hillels? Unfortunately, no, because we see, especially as social media usage moves to younger and younger ages and stages, we can't wait until the college campus experience to figure out how we're dealing with this. There needs to be conversations with middle schoolers, with our tweens, let alone our teens, about what they are encountering as they take these steps towards independence in the digital and in-person spaces, and how we make sure that we keep those communications open so that they're able to ask questions, that they're able to share what they're experiencing and figure out what to do with it, so that they can not only be allies to others, but cultivate allyship for themselves when they are the minority in need of it. And that's what I want to speak to for one more second. I'm just re-sharing my screen, if you will bear with me. So what do we do? While I do not profess to have answers to how to solve the world's oldest hatred, stay tuned for book number 2, perhaps, but not necessarily there yet. I have a few things that I want to recommend. Number 1 is to figure out and name each of our needs. This is for us as the caregivers and stakeholders and parents and grandparents and loved ones of Gen Zers, and for the Gen Zers themselves. What is it that exactly we're seeking? Are we looking for content knowledge to say, oh my gosh, if someone says something about Jews and money, I understand where that's coming from, what that means, and how to deal with it? Are we looking for support? Are we looking for a Jewish community? Are we looking for allies external to the Jewish community? A lot of young people have come to me and to others, so many colleagues in the field, and said, I've shown up as an ally for so many other groups, and when it's my moment in need, they're not coming for me. And what does it mean to cultivate allyship in a reciprocal way, if that's something that someone is seeking? Then to seek out support, the support of the Jewish community, of colleagues, of friends, of peers, of those who are ready and able and excited to raise their voices to advocate for one another in these spaces, both virtual and in person. To fortify our learners, our children, our grandchildren, and ourselves, to say that, again, Judaism can't just be a defiance and being against something and ready and gearing up for the next fight. There needs to be a love, a proactive encounter with Judaism beyond anti-Semitism that satisfies and, again, fortifies us for when these moments, unfortunately, seemingly inevitably occur. Cultivate allyship to figure out who are the people that we need to be in conversation with on a micro and a macro level in order to keep ourselves and our communities feeling safe and connected and empowered. And finally, to educate others, our children, and ourselves to understand what is anti-Semitism, what is Judaism, what is all of the above. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, there was a brief, unfortunate moment in time where COVID was being referred to as the Jew flu in several cities and spaces as Jewish communities contracted the COVID-19 coronavirus. And I spoke with a few students where I was working at the time who had said, oh yeah, Jew flu. And I had to take a pause and say, let's put this in context. Do you know what happened in the past when Jews were accused of bringing a plague to the population? Do you want to talk about like the Black Death and pogroms and crusades and all of the above, giving, again, massive historical situations? an on one foot pithy answer, but to be able to understand what are these anti-Semitic tropes? How are they manifesting today? Why are these things making me uncomfortable if they are? And what do I then do about them? So educating ourselves not only on the context of anti-Semitism, but also on the vast array and network of the Jewish community that's here to help us and empower us and support us as we figure out what to do and how. And before we go into the Q&A, I am also just placing, I'm going to pause again, my info further into the chat, both for anyone who is interested in continuing online, offline convos with me on this or any other topic, as well as the link to hashtag anti-Semitism, coming of age during the resurgence of hate, my book on this topic. And below the link to, I hope this is kosher, below the link to the book itself is also a discount code for anyone who participated in tonight's conversation for a 20% off, which I'm honored to offer all of you and to share out. And now I want to transition, taking a pause, to the Q&A. Those who have already put questions in, I'm going to start reading through, and those who have not, please let's have this be as organic of a conversation, so to speak, as we can, given the platform and the Zoom limits. So first up, we've got, what is your experience with anti-Semitism in America? Hard hitting, perhaps. So I think when it comes to anti-Semitism in America, we're seeing so many different things, and kind of the on one foot of all that I've tried to fit into the last hour. It's on the rise. It's frightening. Thank God we're not at a tipping point yet. I'm not here to be a fear monger. I've heard plenty of people say this is like the lead up to what happened in Germany. This is like the lead up to what happened in the Pale of Settlement. This is a crisis point. I personally do not believe that to be true. I think that we are in a space where we are a strong, loud, proud, powerful Jewish community, and we have the opportunity to turn the tide. I think that we're at a frightening place. I think there are people out there, and increasingly pervasive drumbeat in the world that is happy to go backwards, to take anti-Semitic tropes from the past and repackage them to manifest today, and is doing it in ways that are overt, but also, and sometimes even more frighteningly, in ways that are subtle and we don't always pick up on, particularly, again, young people. I think that there is, though, a difference between now and pretty much any other time in world history, in that we're able to be loud and proud. We have access to power. We have access to actors. We have access to a global network that enables us to encounter this anti-Semitism and to hopefully turn the tide as best we can. And part of that is empowering our young people to feel confident in their ability to be part of that change. Next question that I am seeing is, why do we use the term anti-Semite? Aren't many of the Arab people descendants of Noah's son Shem, where the term comes from? Isn't it just a way of whitewashing the more accurate term, which would be anti-Jewish? Super fascinating question. So why are we actually using the term anti-Semitism? And this was not in the question that was asked, but I would add on to it this question of the hyphen. So you'll see in many spaces anti-Semitism being put as two separate words, anti-Semite. Two different things. Because if you're being anti-Semites, absolutely. Semites come from Shem, from the Torah, from the story of Noah's son Shem, as was mentioned here. And there are many peoples who are descendants of Shem. So is this even about us? My perspective on this is I am not necessarily here to parse the terms. Anti-Semitism, I see as a single word. We're not anti-Semites, but this is the word, this is the nomenclature. I think there's a space in any instance. Jews wouldn't have had the Talmud and Talmudic study going for this long if we weren't willing to parse and delve into every single word. But ultimately, we understand colloquially that anti-Semitism is meant to refer specifically to the Jewish people, the Jewish story, the Jewish collective, as well as Jewish individuals. It's become the accepted term, and I personally have been comfortable with utilizing it. If that is not a space that any of you have found yourselves in and want to specifically speak to anti-Jewish, I don't see that as problematic in any way. Then we have, is it anti-Semitic for a non-Jewish friend to ask my or my Jewish friend's opinion on the Israel-Palestine conflict? How did it make you feel? I do not think there's anything inherently anti-Semitic about asking a Jewish person their opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I do think there's something to be said about equating all Jews with Israel and expecting that you as a Jewish person should have an opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, of putting you into that conversation. It's not necessarily anti-Semitic, but it can be intimidating. It can be a precursor towards saying that your Israel opinions need to align with whatever is acceptable in your facet of American society, or as a Jew, you're going to be held accountable for them. We've seen, particularly on college campuses, Israel and Jewish being equated in really frightening ways. While, of course, the vast majority of Jews feel connected with Israel and are supporters of Israel in whatever it is that means for them, for Jews to be expected to answer for Israel is a really slippery slope. We've seen in one of the UC schools, which I apologize, which one is escaping me at this moment, a Jewish representative to the student government being removed from her position because she was told that she wasn't able to be objective in a university vote about Israel and a potential divestment bill because she was Jewish and therefore couldn't be considered to be objective. That is anti-Semitism. That is saying to someone, we have a double standard and Jews are being held as separate and different from the rest of the population. So a friend asking your opinion, your Jewish opinion on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think is perhaps misguided, depending on where you are in relationship with Israel. But it's when it becomes this double standard that I think we have the question of anti-Semitism. Natan Sharansky, the refusenik and former head of the Jewish Agency for Israel, came up with a test when it comes to all things Israel, for what crosses the line from legitimate questions or criticism or any of the above into anti-Semitism. And it's called the 3D test. And the 3Ds are as follows. If there's demonization of Israel, if Israel or the Israeli people, or in particular Israeli soldiers, are manifested as less than human and are demonized in any way, that crosses the line from legitimate criticism into anti-Semitism. The second one is delegitimization. If the right of Israel to exist as an independent Jewish state is called into question and Israel is being delegitimized, that is crossing the line, as opposed to questions about Israel's policies and Israel's choices and whether or not one agrees with the current Israeli government. Have at it. And the third one is this idea of double standards. If there's something that is not being asked of any other country in the world, but somehow Israel is held to a different double standard, that's where the challenge of anti-Semitism comes, as opposed to holding Israel accountable for its own actions. However, again, one is coming to that conversation. Okay, next up. These are great questions, by the way, and thank you, everyone, for sharing them and for your engagement in this space. As someone who works and interacts with youth and young adults, to what extent do you think that anti-Semitism is a force in influencing their interest in engaging in Jewish life, community or in their Jewish identity? How do you see anti-Semitism versus other experiences, forces, and influence? I sometimes wonder if we focus too much on anti-Semitism as an animating influence. Thank you for this question and for bringing this nuance to the conversation. Anti-Semitism, I believe, is a factor and an important factor in the choices that young Jews are making. It is in no way the only factor in terms of how someone is opting to engage with Jewish life or connect with their own Jewish identities. We see a multifaceted world and a complexity when it comes to making the choice to encounter one's Judaism in a meaningful and profound and proactive way. We see that young people are proud to be Jewish. They love it. It is, in the pop culture zeitgeist, being Jewish is fun and cool sometimes and interesting and something really great. At the same time, though, the questions of anti-Semitism, whether or not they have impacted each young person directly in their lives, and hopefully, again, the dream would be that they don't, the specter is there. And the nervousness, if not coming internally, but being imposed from the rest of the Jewish community. How many of us have, seen programs advertised, and I have run many of these programs. I mean this not to be dismissive in any way, saying you're a high school junior, you're going to be going to college in 2 years. We need to prepare you for standing up for Israel on campus. That's super legitimate. Israel has been attacked in the college campus environment for a very long time, but I would say in this organized way for at least 2 decades now. We want to have opportunities for young people to feel confident in encountering this anti-Israel detractor mindset when they get outside of the protective bubbles of their homes and their schools and their camps and their synagogues, and to in some cases for the first time have to answer for that. At the same time, there might be young people who are saying, leave me alone. I want to go play ultimate frisbee and rush a frat and be pre-med or, explore basket weaving. Their choice, whether to be mobilized on behalf of the Jewish people or to not, both are being made in the context of anti-Semitism. They might not see it that way. They might be saying, anti-Semitism doesn't impact the way that I make any of my choices. I'm, again, going basket weaving, and that's amazing. But if the thing that they're responding to and opting into or out of has come about because of the uptick in anti-Semitism or anti-Israel sentiment and the emphasis that the Jewish community has placed on it, I think it's a key factor, and naming and understanding that is part of how we're able to understand the contemporary Jewish experience of that moment. Next up, how do you think of anti-Semitism through the lens of racism? That is, when are Jews white appearing and when are Jews another race? Such a profound and complex question at this moment, and thank you so much for raising it. And the answer that I want to give that is possibly unsatisfying, so apologies in advance, is that this is the most Jewishly diverse population there has ever been. More Jews than ever are coming from non-white identifying backgrounds or non-white passing, to use that phrase, backgrounds. The perception of the Jewish community as majority Ashkenazi, white, curly, dark hair, large noses, etc., is at once still a trope and a stereotype, and also not the case as we have this increasingly diverse Jewish community. And when we think about anti-Semitism, we have to think about intersectionality. What is the experience of a Jewish young person who looks Jewish, and how does anti-Semitism manifest for them in terms of do they feel physically intimidated because they're worried that people might see them as Jewish? How does it manifest for someone who doesn't look Jewish and might say, I'm Black and Jewish, I'm Asian and Jewish, I'm Latina and Jewish? All of these things exist for me at once. And in an intersectional world, how do my Jewish identity and all of my other minority identities overlap and interact with each other? There's a huge generational shift with so much of this, because I know that many of us, again, I cannot profess to speak for anyone or everyone on this call, feel challenged by conversations about whiteness in America at this moment by saying, I'm Jewish. Yes, my skin is white, but my narrative, my people, my coming of age, my origin story are not the stories of white America. My ancestors were dealing with pogroms and concentration camps. We weren't part of this white shaping of the United States, but I also have the white privilege of today when I walk down the street. And how do I deal with all of that? No satisfactory answers from me, I imagine. But what I really urge all of us to think about is who is part of the Jewish community when we're thinking about it and when we're thinking about anti-Semitism, and how do we factor in the diversity and intersectionality of our community when we think about these questions. In your opinion, who are the individuals or groups responsible for pushing anti-Semitism in America today? How unfortunately exciting. It's a yes and answer from me. We have seen a rise in anti-Semitism from the political left and from the right. We have seen it from typical sources of anti-Semitism and in non-traditional spaces. We are seeing it online and in person. We are seeing Jews in particular cities or Jewish enclaves in LA, in New York, feeling physically intimidated in certain spaces for their Judaism. And we are seeing it in virtual environments, again, with our influencers and this whole world of TikTok and Instagram. There is no shortage of spaces where one can look to say, oh, anti-Semitism is coming from that space. Ultimately, the answer that I would give to like who are the individuals or groups, those who have been throughout history, those who are looking for a scapegoat. I don't know if anyone here is a Harry Potter fan, but one of the characters in Harry Potter is called a boggart, and it's a magical creature that changes its appearance depending upon what is most frightening to the observer. So if one person is looking at it, it might manifest as a ghost. If the next person is looking at it, it might manifest, in my case, as a really small space. Not a fan of small spaces. Claustrophobia is real, people. And for each of us, it manifests as something different. And ultimately, when it comes to anti-Semitism, that is what the Jew is. That we, if you're worried about, we have too much power, we have too little power. We are from everywhere. We're these stateless, wandering wandering population, the wandering Jew, or we are from this other place. We're from Israel. We are everything and we're nothing. We're capitalists and we are socialists. We anything and everything. Anti-Semitism manifests based on not what Jews are actually doing in any time, place, or space, but in terms of what the external population is pinning onto and scapegoating onto the Jewish people. One of the things that I think is really a systemic shift that needs to happen in how we look at anti-Semitism, and in particular anti-Semitism education, is what are we doing internally, but what are we doing externally? Solving the problem of anti-Semitism cannot be the burden of the Jewish people. It's not on us to fix this. The same way, if we look at the culture of sexual violence in the world and violence towards women, to say, is the answer women figure out how to dress differently or not go into certain spaces or not make certain choices? No, we've realized the answer is, how do we as the entire global population of all genders and sexual identities figure out how to protect one another and how to stand up as allies, and to go from having a culture of having to defend against external forces to saying, how do we fix that and make people less likely to attack each other, hopefully one day, God willing. Same thing for anti-Semitism. How do we go from saying, how do I as a Jew explain that I'm not scary and demonic and I don't have horns and I am a proud American as well as a proud Jew and I have a connection with Israel, to saying external world, how do you stop pinning all of this onto us? The burden of solving anti-Semitism can't be on the Jewish community alone. And that's where I go back to the questions of allyship and building relationships with others and being in conversation with the rest of the world and figuring out who are the voices that we need to cultivate and be in conversation with. So next up, I'm seeing there is an urgency right now to train students about anti-Semitism. I'm seeing that as a comment that I just want to highlight and raise up. There is an urgency to this moment, and I in no way mean to take away from the realities of this particular moment that we're living in. We are at once part of this arc of history, this reality, ongoing, unfolding reality of being part of the Jewish people. And there is a special urgency to this moment. We're seeing frightening numbers. We're seeing trends on the rise that should not be, in terms of anti-Semitism and feelings of fear and confusion and intimidation on behalf of Jewish people and Jewish communities today. So yes, absolutely. There is an urgency to this moment, and I appreciate the raising up of it. I think it is wrong. So this is a comment as well. I think it is wrong that the Jewish experience is left out of conscious raising in the DEI initiatives in government, education, and corporations. What can be done about that? Thank you so much for raising this. For those who are unfamiliar with the acronym, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And is basically saying when it comes to questions and conversations about what does it mean to create a more equitable society, which are so important and so critical at this moment, as well as should be in any and all moments. How come Jews are being left out of it? How come we as a minority population are not being included in the yes and of all of the other minority populations that groups and organizations are trying to prioritize and trying to highlight and raise up their voices? So I think a huge part of it is naming that. Is if you're in a space that's having some kind of DEI initiative at work, in a school system, in a local or state or federal government, like yes and all of the above, and Jews aren't being included in that conversation, and Jews aren't part of what others are thinking of, naming it and saying we are a minority population. If you're not associating us with being a minority, is it because of preconceived notions you might have about Jews and power? And should we be further unpacking that? There are examples to be given, things about how we set up equitable systems in schools, in workplaces, about knowing about when our holidays are and not giving tests or deadlines on those days, things that are deeply practical and don't necessarily come from a place of anti-Semitism, but rather of unthinkingness. Giving a space to name that, raise it up in DEI groups and spaces, and again, working as part of allied communities to say we're part of this too. It's really an interesting space to have to claim one's minority status, but to explore what does it mean to be in these minority spaces and to own that part of the Jewish story and the collective Jewish narrative. So thank you so much for that question. I want to be mindful of everyone's time and the thought that has gone into the questions and the listening and all of the above tonight. And as we arc towards a close, to go back to what I had shared earlier about my motivations as an educator. I fundamentally and firmly believe that no standalone event or opportunity should be fully satisfying. I am so honored to have had the chance to speak and to teach a little bit tonight. And I hope that nobody comes away from this saying, I understand anti-Semitism in 2022 right now. I understand what Gen Zers are up against, and like, I got this. I see all of us as part of the lifelong learning and the ongoing arc of learning and understanding that needs to be happening. And would be really excited and honored to see what next steps does everyone feel called to in this moment and in this space. Is there a next article that you want to read? Is there a conversation that you want to have with somebody? Is there a conversation or some soul searching that you want to do within yourself? I really hope that everyone can find some kind of call for a next, whatever that might be, however big, however small, however meta, however tachlis and practical, to continue this conversation and to know that the work of dismantling this world of increasing anti-Semitism is great and can be overwhelming. And we are in this, and we are so fortunate to have a Jewish community of learners and leaders and collaborators and action-based chavruta that are here to be in this conversation with us. So I want to thank everyone. I see that more questions are coming in, and I look forward to being able to answer them again today as well as offline. I'm more than happy to make myself available. And thank you all, and thank you to the Haberman Institute.
Thank you, Dr. Meinrath, for sharing such important narratives and context with our community today. I imagine everyone has gained new insights and can hopefully take this learning into their lives. So we appreciate it. And I'm also hopeful that we can share this recording with the rest. Many of our audience, may not have been able to attend tonight. So I look forward to being able to share it with as many people as possible going forward. So thank you again. And thank you all also for joining us. I look forward to seeing you online soon. As Art said, our next program is in a couple of weeks. So thank you. And have a great rest of your day, everyone.